Okay, so this talk is called State of the Neurotechnology Industry 2022. And I want to just quickly go over some of the key events that have happened in the last year. We're going to talk a little bit more about, sorry about the typo there. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the legal battles going on in the industry. But one of the key events of last year was a settlement between BSC, Boston Scientific, and Nevro. They had been suing each other for years, and they finally decided, look, let's end this. Boston made a big payment. I won't say a big payment. They made a medium-sized payment to Nevro, and they've agreed to kiss and make up. They've kind of divided the world along frequency. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Also, a new form of neuromodulation therapy came out, was introduced this year at the INS meeting in Barcelona. Was anyone in Barcelona at the INS meeting? It was great. It was a great meeting. So Mark Russo, who's one of the leaders of the INS and a pain physician himself, introduced this subwave SCS therapy. What was interesting about it is, aside from it being a new target, it's a new means of delivering the stimulation that he says is compatible with everybody's existing device. So it's not going to be proprietary to Medtronic or to Boston or to Abbott. In theory, it will work with anyone's device. And the most amazing thing is they're not looking for any royalties. They're going to make it available royalty-free to the whole industry. That just kind of blew me away. Also, during the year, just recently, in fact, in the last few weeks, the CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, have made some decisions about non-invasive neuromodulation. We actually have a whole session devoted to that tomorrow that Jeremy Koff is going to lead. We have some experts, some really brilliant reimbursement people on that panel tomorrow. So we're going to talk more in detail about that tomorrow. But that's definitely one of the key events. StimWave filed Chapter 11. We'll talk about that a little bit later. That was clearly a key event. I think a big event from last year is that Abbott was granted breakthrough device designation for its DBS therapy for depression. Very interesting, given that St. Jude Medical, which is a company that Abbott bought a few years ago, had conducted a clinical trial in 2008, the Broaden trial, that unfortunately was halted for a futility analysis. So basically, all of a sudden, 10 years later, 9 years later, whoa, and behold, this therapy is now being revived. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. SCS for PDN, for treating diabetic pain. That's a new thing. So Nevro was first to get approval. Medtronic has also gotten approval. So this opens up the doors to new applications for SCS devices, right? It's been treating chronic low back pain for years. And now to be able to treat diabetic pain opens up the doors to a lot of potential users. So that's a quick rundown of key events. Now, this is a quick snapshot of how big is the market. Well, how big is the market depends on what do you include, right? And different bean counters will include different categories. So I just want to break down for everyone how we see things. And again, we at Neurotech Reports have chosen to really, in terms of our publication, we've chosen to break the industry down into traditional neurotechnology, which includes applications for sensing and delivering stimulation to the nervous system, to the CNS, to the PNS, as opposed to bioelectronic medicine, where you're using neurostimulation to treat a systemic disorder, where the target is an end organ and not the CNS itself. Now, this may be an artificial or it may be just a temporary designation, but for the time being, we see it as two different markets. And that's why we have two different publications, two different sets of market research, and two different conferences. In addition to this conference, we produce the Bioelectronic Medicine Forum in New York City, which will be in April 2023. We'd love to see y'all in New York City. So the markets are different, even though there's a lot of overlap. So what you see on this bar chart between the blue and the orange, so the blue is the overall market for neuromodulation. And if you include everything, you're looking at an $18 billion market by 2027, according to our latest version of this market report, which is called the Market for Bioelectronic Medicine. Now, of that, the core bioelectronic medicine applications, now those would be neuromodulation to affect an end organ like the bladder, like the heart, like the GI system, the circulatory system. That's a smaller but rapidly growing market segment. So again, different companies, different market research firms, different vendors, different publications will use different definitions. We just want you to understand what our definition is and where our lines of demarcation is, because depending on what you choose to include and not include, you can end up with a very different forecast in terms of size of the market. So I want to give it an overview of what's promising, what gets me most excited about what's been happening in the industry in the last year or so. And of course, we're going to talk about this in our third session. After the keynote, we'll have a discussion with investors and the investment community on, is the gold rush over? Maybe, the heyday that we had in the last couple of years of VCs and strategics rushing to get into the neuromodulation market, maybe it's not as strong as it was. We've heard from some investors that there's a little reticence. And as you know, there's a lot of economists who are forecasting a recession. So maybe the overall economy, maybe the overall outlook for neuromodulation isn't as exciting as it was a year ago. On the other hand, there's still a lot of investment that's happening. There's still a lot of government funding that's available. And what's most interesting to me is that there's new indications besides chronic pain, besides some of the movement disorders that the neuromodulation industry has been relying on for the last few years. Chronic pain has been the biggest segment. And it still is. There's still a lot of applications. And as I mentioned with PDN, there's new forms of pain, right? Besides back pain, it's diabetic pain, there's migraine, and there's pain of peripheral origin, different technologies, different vendors, different clinicians, different procedures, different payment reimbursement rates. So we'll talk a little bit about that later, or actually over the 2 days of our conference here. But I want to talk about 5 areas where there's been renewed interest, areas that maybe hadn't been so successful years ago: stroke, SCI, depression, migraine, and Alzheimer's. Each one of those has had pioneers, the people with the arrows in their back, who've tried to, do well and failed either for clinical reasons or for financial reasons or because the market just wasn't ready yet. But now the market seems to be, and it's exciting to me that we're seeing new ventures, new companies coming into markets that had been given up for dead. So stroke rehabilitation, many of you will recall a company called Northstar Neuroscience. Northstar Neuroscience was a Wall Street darling. They raised, tons of money before going public. I think before IPO, it was what, 150 million they raised. Jeremy, does that sound right? And then they went public before, of course, not even forget about before having products on the market, before even getting FDA approval. They went public and they did really well, right? Or their investors did really well. Well, so they had a clinical trial of their stroke rehabilitation therapy, the Everest trial. And guess what? For a lot of reasons, most of which having nothing to do with the therapeutic efficacy, but having to do with the clinical trial design, they failed to meet their primary endpoint. When that happened, the stock just dropped, the company went out of business. And not only did North Star not have a viable stroke therapy, no one else could touch it. No one else would go near that. No VC wanted to put any money into stroke rehabilitation using neuromodulation for many years until last year. And so last year, a product called Vivastim by Microtransponder received FDA approval, and it was exciting to us. It was so exciting to us that we last year gave the Gold Electrode Award for Best New Product to Microtransponders Vivastim. I'm pleased to report that the CEO of Microtransponder will be with us here tomorrow, and we'll be speaking on JoJo's panel on neurorehabilitation. But the fact that they got into the market, they got FDA approval for an implanted therapy for stroke rehabilitation. And now guess what? We have a bunch of new players in the stroke rehabilitation market. We'll talk about a few of those in a minute. SCI, back in the early days when we just started this publication, which was 2001, there was a very promising company called Neurocontrol. It was spun out of Case Western Reserve University in the Cleveland FES Center. And they had a product that was called Freehand. Freehand was a hand grasp stimulator for quadriplegics. And they raised a lot of money. They did well. It was a very different FDA. It was a very different reimbursement landscape. It was not easy, but they did get FDA approval. They finally got some reimbursement, but it wasn't easy. And the problem with that company is that there just weren't enough customers, which is kind of a sad and sick way of thinking about it, right? We don't have enough paralyzed people, so, we're not going to support this product. Essentially, that's what did them in, right? I mean, yeah, there were some other mistakes that were made, but that company did not fail because the therapy failed. The users loved it. In fact, when the company went out of business, they were left holding their own. Thankfully, the Cleveland FES Center said, no, we're not going to leave you on your own. We're going to support you. And to this day, 20 years later, they are supporting those users, right? Well, guess what? And again, for years, VCs didn't want to invest in the SCI market for neuromodulation until just recently. So there's a European company called Onward that spun off from EPFL, but indirectly spun off from UCLA, Reggie Edgerton's work. And they did an IPO and raised 75 million euro. And they have a range of products that are restoring function to people with spinal cord injury, restoring walking function, restoring hand function. But guess what? There's a bunch of new companies, including a new one that I wasn't even aware of called Anuvo. And their CEO is here and going to be presenting some of the really interesting technology that they have to treat paralysis. There's another company called Neuronov. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. It's a European company, I believe out of France, also doing a hand grasp stimulator. In other words, going after the market that Neurocontrol failed in 20 years ago. So the fact that we're seeing companies like this revisit a market years after others have failed, to me is promising. It's reassuring because it's a hint anyway, that tells us that the investment community, that the research community, that the clinician community is a lot more sophisticated now with respect to neuromodulation and neurotech devices and therapies than they were 5, 10, 20 years ago. And that even though the patient population is roughly the same, the aware patient, the aware clinician population is much stronger than it was. And the funds are there. And of course, there's government funding as well as private funding. But that's exciting. Depression's another example. So I mentioned St. Jude Medical's failed trial, the Broaden trial. it was DBS of CG25, the cingulate cortex. And the lead researchers on that trial were Helen Mayberg and Andres Lozano. That trial sadly didn't really fail to meet its clinical endpoint, but it failed a futility analysis. And in retrospect, it looks like what failed wasn't the therapy, but the futility analysis, right? So the FDA was using a time horizon that was appropriate for pharmaceutical therapies, but not so appropriate for medtech or neurotech therapies. It turns out Abbott later released the data that, yeah, if you look at the 3-month data, maybe it wasn't that great, but you look at the 12-month data, you look at the 24-month data, you look at the 36-month data, every year it gets better and better and better. And this is a theme that we see not just in depression, but with a number of different neuromodulation therapies that really makes neuromodulation different in terms of the time horizons compared to the pharmaceutical industry. Later today, we're going to do a session that looks at the inherent bias against neurotech and in favor, that favors the pharmaceutical approach. And we're going to talk about it with respect to some of these indications. But that's something that regulators and payers and clinicians need to keep in mind, is that the time horizon for neurotech therapies might be longer, but it keeps getting better. And that's the good news. Whereas with drugs, yeah, it might tail off. There's this thing called tolerance. Anyone heard of that? So not to say that there isn't tolerance with neuromodulation therapies, there can be. But the point is the fact that Abbott, and now guess what? Several other vendors are looking not just at CG25, but looking at other targets. MF10 turns out to be a really exciting target. Guess what? We've got a session coming up. There's a session for everything, right? We've got a session coming up on DBS, and we've got 1 or 2 vendors who are on the panel, as well as a startup called Motif, very promising company that's offering a DBS solution specifically for psychiatric disorders. So I'm really excited to see vendors revisiting that particular indication. Migraine's another area. We had some companies fail. A company called eNeura, they had a TMS product that failed, not because the device didn't work, but because of financial problems at the company. There was a company called ATI, Autonomic Technologies, that had a minimally invasive device for treating migraine. That company failed not because the therapy didn't work, but because one of their executives decided that it would be a good idea to forge some documents and present those to regulators. That's never a good idea. They got caught. The board just pulled the plug. They said, but again, not because the therapy didn't work. In fact, there's a new company that picked up the therapy, picked up the inventory. It's called Relieve, and even has some of the engineers who worked on the company. And guess what? They got FDA breakthrough device designation for a product that was pulled from the market. And it's the same damn product. It's the same damn therapy, but it works. So the point I'm making here is exciting to see that there's new vendors. We're going to be talking more about migraine over the course of the following 2 days, but I will mention that there's at least two other minimally invasive companies pursuing the migraine market. One of them is a company called Neurotronics, and just by coincidence, it turns out that our next speaker, our keynote speaker, Dr. Jain, has a role at this company. So he may or may not want to say something about Neurotronics. They haven't said a whole lot, but it is a minimally invasive approach. And there's another European company called, what's the Dutch company called? Salvia. And they're in Belgium, they're in Holland. That's a European company, and they have a minimally invasive. Now, in addition, there's a lot of non-invasive therapies for migraine. But again, to me, it's reassuring that there's companies revisiting this market that after other companies have failed. Finally, Alzheimer's. There's a lot that's happening in Alzheimer's, even though a company called Functional neuromodulation, ironically, was launched by Andres Lozano from University of Toronto. He's the guy who, with Helen Mayberg, published that study in 2005 in Neuron that suggested for the first time that, wow, DBS can be really effective for treating treatment-resistant depression. So he moved on and got into Alzheimer's, co-founded a company called Functional Neuromodulation. They did a study, the advanced study, that failed to meet its primary endpoint. And you would have thought, okay, well, that's the end of the company. Well, it wasn't. They've kind of reemerged, and guess what? Breakthrough device status. So they're back in the game, and there's some other players that I'm going to mention in a minute that are pursuing the Alzheimer's market. So what the bottom line here, what I'm getting at is, even though the market for new startups, the investment climate might not be what it was a year ago, the fact that we have companies and investors willing to pony up for new indications that aren't really new, right? They're revisited indications that others had tried in the past and failed, but now you've got new money chasing those failed. To me, that's a sign of maturity. That's a sign that this industry is growing, and we're not putting all of our chips in chronic pain. We're not putting all of our chips in Parkinson's disease. Not to say that those are mature markets at any stretch. There's still the penetration rates are well below 10%, in those, but we don't have to rely on that. All right, let's talk a little bit about Alzheimer's disease. So here's 4 companies that are pursuing different approaches. Some are using non-invasive SIM, a wearable. Some are using more invasive. So I mentioned functional neuromodulation, which is basically a DBS of the fornix. They got breakthrough device designation, and they've done a new advanced study, the Advanced 2 study, that's currently underway. There's also a company called NeuroEM. They have a headset, and it supplies electromagnetic energy, and they received breakthrough device designation for treating Alzheimer's. There's a company called Cognito Therapeutics. They're pursuing a photomodulation. By the way, everyone's going to get a copy of my slides, so don't feel like you have to jot all these notes down. I mean, you can if you want, but you'll get them. So Cognito's doing a photomodulation. And then there's a company called Insightec that's using focused ultrasound. In the SCI market, here's some of the new, I mentioned some of these new players. And in stroke, I'm not going to play this video because I'm running a little short on time. On stroke, there's some new therapies that are using both non-invasive and invasive approaches to treating stroke disorders. There's a dysphagia company. It turns out dysphagia is, a serious problem, and it affects a lot of stroke patients. So there's a European company called Phagenesis that just recently got marketing approval. You've got a company called BrainQ. You've got this hand-worn device from Neurolution. These are some of the new neuromodulation approaches to treating psychiatric disorders. So you've got TMS, and you've got TDCS, and you've got non-invasive VNS, and you've got implanted VNS, and you've got TNS. So different technologies, a range of companies that are either already cleared or cleared in Europe or in a pivotal trial. Quick talk about some of the recent regulatory approvals that have happened in the last year. I know I've got a few minutes left. Nevro just recently got approval for its Senza HF-X-IQ. This is an AI-based SCS application, very interesting, and it includes the ability to service the PDN application, the painful diabetic neuropathy, which again is a new market, a new indication that really expands the potential market for SCS devices. Magnus Medical recently got FDA clearance for its Saint TMS. It's a new and enhanced and improved form of transcranial magnetic stimulation for treating depression. Abbott recently got a regulatory approval for its Proclaim Plus. We have Erica Ross from Abbott. Erica, are you with us on Zoom? I hope you are, because you're going to be on one of the next panels. But hopefully we'll be hearing from Abbott a little bit later. A company called Neurolace has a non-invasive pain therapy called Axon that got approval. And then, of course, a big one was Saluta's Evoke SCS. And what made that so exciting is its closed loop neuromodulation therapists. All right, in addition to new approvals, a bunch of companies got breakthrough device designation. I can't list them all here, but a few that I'll mention are a European company called Precisis. They have a brain stimulator. They're looking at a number of indications, including epilepsy. A company called WaveGate has an optical reflectometry system, more of a neurosensing system. Neurometrics got regulatory approval for a couple of different indications, including chemotherapy-induced pain. Again, a new form. It's pain, but it's a new form of pain, a new indication. That's kind of exciting. They've also been approved for fibromyalgia. So again, new flavors of pain that will help expand the market. A company called BlackRock, who we're going to hear from their CEO later today. Right? Jojo, we're going to hear, he's going to hear, right? It's your job to make sure he gets here. Okay. So they got breakthrough device designation for their BCI. It's an implanted device called Move Again. Very promising. So we're going to hear more from them. Lots of VC funding activity, despite all the prognostications of a down market. I'm not going to go through all of these, but again, you'll get a copy of my slides, and here's some of the highlights of startups that got some VC funding this year. I mentioned. All right. My slide's not advancing. There we go. Whoops, it advanced too far. Some significant legal battles. Really, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that, but if you are interested in kind of a rundown of these four major cases, the Mann Foundation versus Cochlear, Medtronic versus Axonics, Boston Scientific versus Nevro, and of course, Stimwave versus the Perrimans. I'm not going to talk about a lot about that right now, but if you're interested in more details, I left you an article from Neurotech Business Report in August where we talked about all four of those cases, so you can get more information if you're interested. Finally, I like to leave y'all with some noteworthy quotes stolen from the pages of our newsletter, Neurotech Business Reports. I thought this was a good one. Andres Lozano, I mentioned him. He was one of the featured speakers at the INS meeting in Barcelona earlier this year, and he asked the rhetorical question, who's killing these dopamine neurons? What can be done to put the brakes on it? And then, of course, he went on to point to a likely suspect. The usual suspect. Dustin Tyler from Case Western Reserve University had an opportunity to visit the White House, and of course, being the good guest that he was, had to say something good about the host. So his quote was, "I really believe the president has a genuine concern and wants to make a difference for people." And by president, he was referring to Joe Biden. I thought that was interesting, just getting an opportunity. At the what was this? At the LSI meeting. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. We've got the wrong attribution there, but it was an investor who was comparing the market today to back in '96. And in 1996, you could take anything public. But now we've been able to prove that you can actually make money in medtech. What he was getting at was during, the .com era, it didn't really matter whether you could make money. People were just throwing money at anything. Now, look, you can actually make money. So if you're an investor, come on in. And then finally, so Jay Watkins, he was the guy who made that comment. Sorry, I have my attribution screwed up here. I don't know what happened. The final comment actually came from Paul LaViolette. Seems to be flowing a little bit too liberally. He's talking about breakthrough device designation. He was concerned that, maybe there were too many of them. All right, so I'm just going to leave you with a preview of what's coming up in some of the upcoming sessions that are going to be exciting. I mentioned the DBS session, lots happening there. We're going to hear from some key players in that market. Jojo Platt put together a really interesting session on privacy, security, and ethics. That's going to be later today. Ethics in neurotech, Tomorrow, we're going to be doing the session on CMS payment decision. We're going to go into more detail about CMS payment decisions. And we'll also have a session on outsourcing, where we have representatives of 3 key players, including Andy Kelly from Certec, including Mr. Putnam from MST, and Hannah. Good to see you, Hannah, who came all the way from England. I think she gave up her opportunity to go to the coronation. Is that true? That just to come to the Neurotech Leaders Forum? I mean, that, oh, that hasn't been scheduled yet, sorry. So anyway, she's going to be on that panel. And then we're going to conclude tomorrow with a discussion of new ground, some of these new areas of pain beyond, failed back surgery syndrome, beyond chronic low back pain, a lot of new areas of pain. So we're going to talk about new ground for pain neuromodulation. So that's basically my talk.